Which asshole?
He's a health commissioner. He's an example of God will punish those who fuck with others. He was in a coma. He went into a coma.
You know, I love this is the spirit we need, Lois.
After 10 months in a coma, he passed.
That's too bad. Did you cry?
No, I celebrated. But his wife and children did, right?
Arm and Hammer.
Yeah, that's where Luella was. This is my street, 101st Street. The guys with the spacesuits, while the children were on bicycles behind there. Yeah. Hi.
Oh, another one.
Good.
Yeah, that
Look
one,
at that.
I don't know if I've seen this particular one, but I've sort of seen it.
What's happening there? How you
It's nice
doing?
to finally meet you.
Gustavo, nice to meet you.
Arian.
Come on.
You're featured quite prominently here, my
Look
dear.
at this picture.
Well,
That's
you know
awesome.
why? Because I'm the most photographed person there. I mean, Barbara Quimby was.
All right, if everyone will take their seat,
So,
we can get
Arian,
going.
I mean, Carter only has two photos. You got like
Consider the source.
This is Lois. Have you met?
Hey,
Very nice to meet you.
Arian is interning with us.
Okay.
This is Ken. This is
Nice
Arian.
to meet you, Arian.
Arian is going to be a lawyer someday.
Someday.
Okay. Well,
And
we
he's
gotta
gonna be
teach you the right
suing-
way how to do the
Please
law.
do.
Exactly.
Law is not equal justice.
Hey,
Some seats over here, too, if you want some. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Alyssa Muscatine. And let me say at the start how truly exciting it is to be holding an event in person. After a 2-year interruption because of the pandemic, of course, we resumed in-person events here at the Connecticut Avenue store only earlier this month. And while we will continue to do some events online in the weeks ahead, we're planning to schedule more and more events in person as the pandemic recedes, which I'm sure we all hope it will continue to do. I also want to take this opportunity to say that, P&P simply could not have survived the pandemic without continued support from loyal customers like yourself and from our tireless and courageous staff. So I want to thank everybody. As you know, as a business, we're not quite yet back to where we were before the pandemic, but we're getting there. And I remain confident about the future. Now, on with our featured attraction. We're delighted to have with us this evening the journalist Keith O'Brien. He's here to talk about his new book, Paradise Falls, the true story of an environmental catastrophe. Keith's a former staff writer for the Boston Globe and the New Orleans Times-Picayune. And he's written for the New York Times and Politico as well. He's also a longtime contributor to National Public Radio, where he's appeared on a number of programs. Keith's 2 previous books include Fly Girls, about 5 remarkable female pilots who made history racing planes, and An Outside Shot, which was his first book, about a high school basketball team in Kentucky and its quest to win the state championship in the 2009-2010 season. In Paradise Falls, Keith tells the story of one of America's most devastating toxic waste disasters, which emerged in the late 1970s in a suburb of Niagara Falls. There, residents started noticing a number of ominous signs, chemical smells, fume clouds, gas leaks, damaging health problems, all of which in time galvanized local citizens to action in the face of corporate denial and resistance and government indifference. Eventually, the campaign attracted national attention and federal involvement, and as Keith recounts, led to landmark legislation and the transformation of environmental policy in this country. A lot of great research went into this book. Keith and I were just talking about how the pandemic both helped in some ways and also was a complicated time to try to finish a book like this, and you may hear more about that in a second. But he writes the book really like a thriller, with ordinary people at the center of fighting against steep odds to save their families and our public health. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Keith O'Brien.
Thank you, Tom, for that introduction, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight. So I'm going to geek out for a second here. Authors obviously love books. We also love bookstores, and for all sorts of reasons. Often for personal connections. And I just have to say, Politics and Prose is one of my absolute favorite stores, and it's such a pleasure to be here and to be back and to be in person. With this crowd in particular, and we'll talk about it here this evening. But tonight is really a collective celebration. There are people here in this audience tonight without whom this book doesn't happen, without whom this narrative actually doesn't play out in the way it did in the 1970s. And so this is really a collective celebration here tonight. So we are going to talk about this crisis, one of the great environmental crises of the 20th century. We're going to talk about how it emerged, what happened, why it still matters today. And we are going to spend a lot of time talking about these ordinary folks, primarily mothers, who forced this story into the spotlight and almost by accident ended up changing the world. This is, to me, a story of resistance. It is a story of epic proportions. In the span of 2 years, these mothers would go from being ignored by their local officials, their school board and superintendent, to having the ear of Jimmy Carter in the White House. And they would find themselves staring down one of the most powerful corporate executives in America at that time and winning. And that is the story of Paradise Falls. But before we get into all that, I want to talk to you about something smaller. A small behind-the-scenes moment from my research, from my reporting. I want to begin tonight with the story of a bird. In one of my very first interviews for this book, I was talking to a woman named Luella Kenny. Luella was a mother of 3 boys in the 1970s, who with her husband Norman here had purchased a home on the east side of Niagara Falls. It was a small red brick house on 96th Street, and it was for the Kennys a perfect place to raise a family. The house was located on the northern edge of a tidy grid of streets about 6 miles due east of the waterfalls that we all know. This neighborhood was called LaSalle. And though the houses here were small, by and large, ranchers, single-story starter homes, it was a desirable place to live. These were people who were scraping their way to the middle class on factory workers' wages, by and large. And these were young families with children. And the children liked to gather on a rectangular expanse of land right in the heart of that neighborhood that the kids simply called the playground. Now, many adults wondered why this rectangular plot of land had never been really developed. But the children asked no questions, because for them this was a magical place. There was a school at the heart of it. There were play structures. And on weekday afternoons or weekends, they could find their friends here. This was the reason, actually, why many people moved to the neighborhood, the proximity to this playground and this school. But the Kennys had another reason. Their house was located here on the far northern edge of the neighborhood, in this sort of elbow turn on 96th Street, away from the traffic. And they had a large backyard that backed up into a confluence of creeks. This yard was a perfect playground for children. It was paradise. And in the summers, the Kenny boys would slosh through the waters of the creek. In winter, they would skate on them. And then in 1978, a problem. people in the neighborhood began learning of secrets that were buried in the ground right in the heart of that neighborhood, right beneath that playground in school. One of the Kenny boys began to get sick with a set of symptoms that mystified local doctors. And Luella Kenny at that point does what a mother does. She fixated her attention on her son, on her home, on her yard, on those creeks. Luella began to wonder what was in the water. In the months ahead, Luella would actually go back to those creeks. And she would crouch down at the edge and she would keep a log. She would keep a record of what she saw, a log that she would later share with me. And she would write things like water level high, some oil slicks, murky, deep orange appearance, odor permeates the air, oil slicks moving down the creek, deep orange color from drain to point where major part of creek is starting, odor present in entire backyard. And that brings me back to the story of the bird. You know, sometimes in research and reporting, people tell you things that are too fantastic, too alarming, too sensational, or too good to be true. And when that happens as a nonfiction storyteller, the first question you ask is, how am I ever going to prove this? How am I ever going to know if this is real? And how would I ever be able to use this in a book? And the bird story for me is really one of those moments. For Luella Kenny, it was just a memory. She said that one day she went back to those creeks behind her house on 96th Street. And she told me that on this day she was joined by two scientists. And she told me that as she turned away from the creek, she heard the two men speaking in agitated voices. And then one of the men, she said, was running up through the trees to meet her. And he asked a question. He said he wondered if they might be able to store something in her freezer. In that moment, a small songbird had just landed in the edge of the creek and dipped its beak in the water. The water that Luella Kenny was increasingly convinced was contaminated and perhaps even the source of her family's problems. And this bird had toppled over and died right there. That story happened something like 43 years ago. And part of the challenge for me in writing this book was parsing fact from fiction, truth from lies, especially in a story where so many people obfuscated for so long. And for me, this is a process that required, 130 hours of interviews, thousands of pages of documents, some documents that had to be acquired only through Freedom of Information requests, 42 years after the fact. And of course, I was doing this work on the cusp of, or in the teeth of, the lockdown pandemic, which I think we can all agree was the worst time in our lives. And so I did wonder at times if I would ever be standing here, if I would ever actually finish this project. And so it is really great to be here, and also a relief, frankly. Tonight we're going to have a conversation. I'm going to take your questions, but I want to give everybody a foundation for this story, a picture of the place we're talking about here and the people who were involved. Let's start with, for starters, what you think of typically when you think of Niagara Falls. You think of the waterfalls and postcards and honeymooners walking hand in hand on the Esplanade, traffic jams. Maybe if you're old enough, you think about Superman, the movie. But just a couple miles away, the real work of Niagara Falls was happening and is happening. Chemical plants dotted the landscape up and down the Niagara River. DuPont, Union Carbide, Carborundum, and there was this place called Hooker Chemical. And at points in the 20th century, Hooker Chemical was both the largest employer in town and the largest industrial taxpayer. Effectively, Hooker Chemical kept the lights on, financed the snowplows, helped the schools, did good work. providing people the chemicals they need to make the rubber soles of their shoes or their fire retardant sofas, and also supported local artists. But most importantly, Hooker provided jobs. At its peak, the company employed about 3,000 people in town. And if you were a man, in particular, if you were a white man, and by the way, you did have to be a white man, you could make it all the way to the top at Hooker Chemical. You could be an executive, have a corner office, travel the world on the corporate jet. And if you were really lucky, you could fly with this man here, who acquired Hooker Chemical in 1968. He was one of the richest men in America, one of the most powerful lawyers at his beck and call. He was the chairman of Occidental Petroleum. That is Arm & Hammer. But for all the good work that Hooker does in town, the jobs it provides, the profits it generates, it also generated its fair share of problems, at times shocking problems. At the plant along the river, workers were injured with alarming regularity. And neighbors suffered too, as clouds of noxious fumes wafted upriver. Workers also died at Hooker Chemical, again, at times with alarming regularity, in explosions, chemical fires, accidents that defied explanation. At least twice in the 1960s, manhole covers popped and blew on Buffalo Avenue right in front of the factory, skittering into oncoming traffic like iron frisbees. And then, of course, there were those secrets, things that people in power in Niagara Falls knew. Not just people at Hooker, but at the city too, but that almost no one else did. And these secrets were buried in that neighborhood on the east side of town, right beneath that playground and school. In the 1940s and 50s, Hooker Chemical buried roughly 21,000 tons of chemical waste here, often in 55-gallon drums piled helter-skelter on top of one another. And my research makes clear that as early as 1946, just 3 years or so after they began dumping at the canal, at this place, this old canal, this place built by William T. Love, the Love Canal, Hooker knew it had a problem. For starters, there was this memo here, which might be hard to see in the back, but I'll read the relevant parts to you. This memo is written in August 1946, and executives are concerned. They say, quote, "We are now in the embarrassing situation of having used this property, the Love Canal, for a dump for some 3 years without ownership or even permission." But 2 days later, the lead corporate attorney for Hooker wanted the CEO to know that he actually had concerns that were far greater than just permission. This attorney was not a scientist, but he'd been out to the site, and he writes that, quote, "To my inexperienced eye, it seemed clear that the water was contaminated. More worrisome, he'd seen children walking in their bathing costumes up to the edge of the canal." And given that, the attorney concluded that Hooker Chemical was running a, quote, "real hazard" in this part of Niagara Falls. 6 years later, in 1952, these hazards had only grown. In the post-war years, Niagara Falls was growing, and the population was pushing east, pushing out to that rural area of LaSalle, pushing out toward Love Canal. And of course, in the subsequent several years, many more chemicals had been put in the ground, including 3 that I wanted to mention. Hooker dumped something in the canal called thionyl chloride. This was a pale yellow liquid with an irritating odor. The name itself means nothing to most people, but it is the fundamental compound of mustard gas. They buried lindane, which is a white powdery element and an essential compound of many pesticides. And they also buried something called 1245 tetrachlorobenzene, which is a white, odorless solid, insoluble in water, that was known to spawn a particularly harmful byproduct, that is dioxin, which, as some of you will know, was the fundamental element of Agent Orange. So that spring, in the spring of 1952, when the local school board reaches out to Hooker to ask about purchasing this land to build a school, Hooker initially is concerned for all the obvious reasons. As they will say in internal memos that spring, this land isn't suitable for these purposes. But over the course of just a month, the opinions inside Hooker begin to change. And they begin to change for many reasons, but at least for one. As they write in April 1952, the Love Canal property, quote, is rapidly becoming a liability. And so, in the coming months, Hooker strikes a deal to give the land, this canal, to the Board of Education for $1. And up goes that school, and around it grows that neighborhood. And it should be noted that the problems began almost immediately. Children reported burns on their skin and eyes. Fires at times broke out on the old canal, now the heart of a residential neighborhood. On at least one occasion, one of those buried drums of thionyl chloride buried in the ground exploded on a quiet Sunday morning, scattering its contents over nearby houses. And I think most alarming, to me anyway, children reported something that seemed inexplicable. The children said that on the playground they could find rocks that spontaneously combusted, rocks that would catch on fire. Now, again, here's one of these moments where you stop and say, this cannot be true. But in interview after interview with people who lived in the neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s, and more importantly, with children who had grown up in the neighborhood in the 1960s and 70s, they talked about the fire rocks. And then in my research one day, inside the Niagara Falls Public Library, running through microfilm, I found this story here from March 1966. The story said that the school principal was concerned because children on the playground were finding rocks that would catch on fire. One rock apparently even caught fire inside a boy's pants pocket. And the city's top health official would say in this story that he wanted the people to know he was concerned about the fire hazard. But his solution to the problem was as follows, and I quote, he advised anyone finding the material, these rocks, to immediately submerge it underwater or bury it. So a series of poor decisions by multiple parties has led to an unprecedented problem in the heart of an American neighborhood with roughly 1,000 families, black and white. And then in 1977, this problem begins to surface in ways that residents have not seen before. And my characters, the characters in Paradise Falls, begin to fight back. And I want to introduce you to a few now. This is a picture here of Bonnie Casper in the middle of this photo in the patterned shirt, and two people to the right of her in the tie is Congressman John LaFalce from Niagara Falls. Bonnie Casper was a young legislative aide for John LaFalce, who had come to Washington right here in the way that many young legislative aides come to this city. She came here to change the world. But her job working for John LaFalce wasn't the most interesting thing in the world. He didn't have the best committee assignments. He worked in small business and banking. And then in June 1977, months before these hazards would begin to make widespread headlines, and 14 months before they would make national headlines, Bonnie Casper gets a call that there's problems on the east side of town. The call is from concerned bureaucrats small-time bureaucrats within the city of Niagara Falls who are looking for help, looking for money, and hoping that Bonnie might be able to help them. In my reporting for this book, of course, I tracked down John LaFalce, the congressman. He is still alive today. And I did a couple interviews with John early on in the late summer of 2019. And on the phone, as we started to get deeper and deeper into conversation, he said, you know who you really need to talk to is Bonnie Casper. But it actually took a little doing to find her. And then I finally did. And Bonnie is no longer working in politics. She's in commercial real estate here in the DC metro area. And I tracked her down here, and I visited her at her office. And Bonnie told me before I came that she had some boxes that she had kept. Because as she told me, I was there at the start. And I said, boy, it'd be really nice if you could bring those boxes. And I met her at her office, and I was not really expecting the size of what Bonnie had. And when I got there, I realized that I was not going to be able to review it in the time that we had allotted. And we're talking about, I think it was like 2 whole boxes of, container boxes. And so Bonnie said you could take it home. And so I had to hustle out of her office and go buy a piece of luggage just so I could get them on the plane back to New Hampshire where I live. And Bonnie Casper is here tonight. Will you stand up, please, Bonnie? So Bonnie Casper is there pushing this rock forward. And another key person who helps is a woman named Beverly Pagan. Beverly was a scientist, a PhD level biologist who lived in Buffalo, about 25 minutes away. She did not live in this neighborhood. She had no children in this neighborhood. She had nothing to lose and no children to worry about. But Beverly was a mother. And she was also a scientist who was a little ahead of her time. As early as the early 1970s, Beverly makes a connection, and she believes that our environment, pollution, smog, other things, might actually have a detrimental effect on our health. And she writes several papers about that idea, including early papers that make a scientific connection between the notion that cigarette smoking might lead to cancer. And so when this problem emerges 25 minutes from her house, of course she takes an interest. And she goes out there and she runs her tests. And pretty quickly, within a matter of just a few weeks, Beverly Pagan realizes that she believes the problem extends much further than what state officials are willing to say at that time. And this poses a particular problem for Beverly Pagan because the medical institute that she worked for in Buffalo was affiliated with the University at Buffalo. And because it was at the University of Buffalo, it was really a state entity. And so effectively, Beverly Pagan was working for the State Department of Health. And so when she begins to make public statements in the early fall of 1978 that are at odds with what her superiors in Albany are saying, she begins to pay a price for that almost immediately. Just like with Bonnie, I was able to track down Beverly Pagan. She lived in Maine, Bar Harbor, Maine, about 4 hours north of me. And in early 2020, January and February of 2020, I made 2 visits to her house there. And we spent the whole day together talking about this time she had spent at Love Canal. And while I was there, Beverly told me that she too had boxes. As she would say, I have a whole file cabinet, maybe 4 drawers and 7 or 8 boxes. And she also let me take those home with me. And, shortly thereafter, I was at the New York State Archives in Albany. And when you go to an archive, when you're doing a project like this, you're going for targeted things often, but then you search for everything. I'm going to search for everybody I'm writing about, just in case. And, in the history of the state of New York, there have probably been, millions of state employees. And I can tell you for a fact that almost none of them have files at the state archives in Albany. But when I searched for Beverly Pagan, a file did pop up. And it said Beverly Pagan employment file. So I asked to see it. And I was denied because it was considered private. So I filed a Freedom of Information request. And I told Beverly that she should do the same because it's her file. But just days after these meetings, her husband dies, her partner of 50 years. The pandemic hits. By June 2020, Beverly Pagan has died herself. And I had to wait about 10 months for those records to come back from the state of New York. And in the end, it was about 330 pages of documents related to Beverly's employment at Roswell Park. Beverly had long believed that she was being followed. She told me that she often made phone calls from payphones on the street, CIA style, because she believed they were listening in on her calls. I found no evidence of those things. But what I can tell you from those records I received from the state of New York is that they were following her in the sense that they wanted to know where she was and who she was talking to at all times. The highest ranking health officials in the state of New York, all the way up to the doorstep of the governor, wanted to know what Beverly Pagan was saying. And even now, 42 years later, they were still so concerned about those records that many of them, when I received them, were heavily redacted. Aline Thornton was a resident of a modern public housing development just on the western edge of this old canal and landfill. And Aline Thornton had lived in this development for much of her adult life. And when the problems begin to surface in 1977 and 1978, Aline Thornton and others in that development begin to connect the dots in the way the parents do. And Aline Thornton thought immediately of her son here, Gregory, born in 1960, but who would not see his second birthday. Gregory Thornton died of leukemia on that land. And Aline could not help but think that what had happened to her son might just be connected to what was in the ground. And she, like many mothers in this neighborhood, would, for the first time in her life, become radicalized and decide to protest and decide to march and decide to send letters. And then there's Lois Gibbs. Lois Gibbs was a mother of 2 children on 101st Street, on the other side of the canal, the eastern side, 2 blocks away from the playground and the school. This is Lois with her children, Michael and Melissa. And, you know, prior to any of this surfacing in 1977, Lois considered herself just a housewife, as you would have said at the time, stay-at-home mom. She had, struggled to graduate from high school and was, in fact, self-conscious speaking in front of others. Worried about speaking up at the PTA meetings and such things. But when these problems emerge, Lois too begins to connect the dots in the way that parents do. And she immediately thought of her son, Michael. In the fall of 1977, Michael begins attending school on top of that landfill. And when he does, at that moment, he is as healthy as any boy should be. But by Christmas that year, Michael is suffering from seizures. And, Lois immediately, when she begins reading the news in the paper shortly after Christmas that year, immediately begins to connect those dots. And, she does at that point what any parent might do. She goes to the school board and the superintendent, and she asks if maybe they might move her son from that school to a different school in the fall. And, I often have thought what might have happened with this story if they had satisfied that request, if they had said sure. But they didn't. They told her the school was fine. It was completely healthy to be there. There was no problem. And Lois at that point becomes angry. And she begins to go door to door in her neighborhood, collecting signatures on a petition in which she hopes to shut down the school at least until they can learn more. And Lois is stunned in August 1978 when the state decides not to do that, but instead to recommend the evacuation of roughly 200 families right around the canal. And then days later decides to shut down the school. Lois, however, lives outside that first evacuation zone, as roughly 700 families did. Imagine being in that house, looking out over the vacant houses and wondering, where is the blockade that stops the chemicals from reaching my yard, from reaching my kids? And so Lois begins to push for change. And more than any other person in this neighborhood, Lois will put herself on the line again and again and again to save her family and to save others in that neighborhood. You know, a couple things have been said to me, some recently, some long ago, that are just shocking. On one of my first trips to Buffalo, I went to the federal courthouse, and I had a book in my briefcase that was related to Love Canal, a long ago academic book. And as the security guard was going through it, he saw it. And he doesn't know me. He doesn't even know why I'm there. He sees it, and he goes, "Oh, I know that woman who was in this story. They paid her off. She got rich, and she got out, and she's living in Washington now." I'm like, it's crazy. It's crazy. And then just last night, at a book event in Boston, giving a similar kind of talk, during the Q&A, a man from Niagara Falls raised his hand and said, with a bit of contrition, that he was stunned to hear this story now. Because as he said growing up, we maligned Lois Gibbs in our neighborhood because she was hurting our property values, because she was scaring everybody. It is Lois who, in the span of 2 years, more than anyone else, who will get the attention of high-ranking officials, including Jimmy Carter. And it is Jimmy Carter who will say in the fall of 1980 that without Lois Gibbs, none of this would have happened. And Lois Gibbs is also here tonight. Lois, will you please stand? And Michael. And then, of course, there's Luella Kenny. You know, it's Luella who will stare down that corporate executive, a 42-year-old mother of 3, confronting Arm & Hammer. And, you know, for me, that was relatively easy to confirm. There were news stories about it. There were multiple witnesses to interview. And in my research, I actually found a transcript of this confrontation at Columbia University, of all places. But the bird story was harder to confirm. You know, on my research trips to Buffalo, Niagara Falls, State Archives in Albany, the National Archives in Washington here, nothing about the bird. And, you know, then one day I started visiting a university in Boston, Tufts University. And I was going there because Lois Gibbs had left her papers there many years ago. To be clear, your papers are essentially all your important documents, your letters, your memos, your journals, the mail you received, maybe the mail you sent. To someone like me, that's everything. And so, of course, I wanted to spend time with Lois Gibbs's papers at Tufts. And, you know, in reading some of these documents, I found 2 large files, very thick files that were labeled daily status updates, daily reports. And they were written by a scientist who had been hired by the state to consult with the residents. Essentially, a third-party scientist who could come in and assist the residents and give them his own advice, separate from whatever they were hearing at the state. And these daily reports were essentially just a way to log his time and prove that he was doing his work. And I should say, by the way, he is here too tonight, Stephen Lester, right here. And the name rang a bell for me because Stephen Lester, after all the dust settles in Love Canal, marries Lois Gibbs. They're still married today, 40 years plus, right? Yeah. So here are these reports from Stephen Lester, where he's, basically validating that he's working. And at the top of each of these reports, it says, work voucher daily report. There were a few hundred of them. Some of them 3 to 4 pages long, written at times in dense scientific language with chemical figures and scientific sketches. Sorry, Stephen, it wasn't the most exciting reading. But I reach the spring of 1979. And in this moment, as I'm reading these reports, Stephen Lester is now visiting houses. He says, we're going out and we're testing sites in the neighborhood. And he notes that he's going with a second scientist. And this is familiar, of course, because Luella had mentioned 2 scientists. And so now I'm paying very close attention. And my eyes are not glazing over anymore. And finally, I reached June 7th, 1979. It was a Thursday, warm and cloudy in Niagara Falls. Rain was going to be moving in overnight. And the daily report that day starts the way that all of Stephen's reports did. He logs his time. He worked on that day from 9 a.m. to 5:30. He notes at the start that they're doing remediation on the canal. The trucks are moving in and out. He notes that they're cutting down trees and putting up a fence. And then on the second or third line, he reports that on this day he's visiting a, quote, number of homes. And one of these homes, he said, was on 96th Street, 1064 96th Street, a house that he said belonged to Mrs. Kenny, Kinney. Stephen misspells her name because, of course, he does not know Luella. But at the rest, he gets right. He notes she had complained of chemical odors in the back of her home in the creek, which borders her property. It was quite obvious, he added, that chemicals were indeed present in this creek. And then down at the bottom of this page, in a file containing thousands of documents, in a small room inside Tufts University that almost no one ever goes to, Stephen Lester writes something that stops me. He says, while we were visiting Mrs. Kenny, a bird which was feeding in the creek collapsed and died. And in that moment, I knew a few things. I knew Luella was telling the truth. And I knew that Lois Gibbs and Bonnie Casper and Aline Thornton and Beverly Pagan probably were too. I just needed to keep going, find the documents, do the interviews, do the work. I was alone in this archive, but I was on the right path. And I want to thank you for listening to me. And if you'd like, I'll read something from the book, or we can just skip straight to Q&A. We'll make it a conversation.
If you have a question, could you step up to that microphone because we're recording the event? If you have a question, just step up to the microphone. Microphone's to the right up here. It's right on the other side of the pillar.
I'm just curious what got you initially involved in this story? Where did it start?
So the question is, how did I get started in this story? Where did it start? So as Tom mentioned at the outset, my last book was called Fly Girls, Narrative Nonfiction of Female Pilots in the 1920s and 30s. Obviously, when I wrote that book, all of those main protagonists were gone. But what I mourned during the writing of it and the research of it was that some of those main protagonists had lived deep into the 1970s. One of them had lived to 1979. And nobody had found her. Nobody had done an interview. Nobody had tracked her down. And so as I came out of that book, I was looking around and I was thinking about, well, what are the stories around us right now? where people maybe once played an important role, but we have forgotten them, and maybe they are still around. And, you know, I'm going to date myself here. I'm a child of the 80s, but I was born in the 70s. I do have a few snippets of memories from the decade. You know, I remember the gas lines and being in my mother's station wagon. You know, I remember the blizzard of 1977. I remember the hostage crisis and not understanding why the president couldn't get the people home as a little kid. And I remember this place called Love Canal. But like a lot of people, I didn't really know what it was. And so, you know, I just started digging in. And, you know, my first two interviews were with Luella Kenny and with Lois Gibbs. And they were phone interviews. And it was, you know, pretty clear after a few interviews that there was something here. And so, you know, I started making some early research trips, you know, down to Tufts, close by, Albany I could drive to, just to see what was there. And I will say that for every book that I might write, there's 12 books that end up in the trash heap, even after I might have made some of these research trips. But it was clear from the beginning that there was something here. And I should say, too, to me, it's like, this isn't just history of a long ago thing that you maybe sort of remember. To me, what makes it interesting and powerful is its relevance, you know, today. Because it wasn't just one little mistake that led to the problems in the neighborhood. It was dozens of them. Dozens of little mistakes and some big mistakes. And committed by multiple people. And sometimes it was just not standing up to say anything, right? Not just saying, maybe we shouldn't do this. And in the same way, it wasn't just one moment that turned the tide. You know, as you'll read in the book, there are some big moments. You know, Lois was at the center of many of them. And sometimes when people tell this story, they boil it down to that, as if you could just do one thing on one day and suddenly everyone will listen to you. But as, you know, people in this room know, in fact, more than I do, that's not how it works. You have to show up again and again and again to get the change you want. And that, to me, is a very relevant story today.
I hope you are taking your talk and periodically going to journalist schools and talking to writers. What do you tell them about what this means to you that you think might help the next generation?
The question is, you know, what would I tell journalists or the next generation about these kind of stories? I think the mistake perhaps that younger journalists or aspiring journalists or historians might make is that, you know, it's all about the writing. And it is. Writing's incredibly important. You can have all the material, but if you don't know how to build it out in the right way, it's not going to resonate with people. But you need to have the material, you know? And so, you know, that's why, you know, when I interview folks, whether it's for this book or another book, and we're done with the interview, you ask, did you keep anything? Photos, letters, did you keep a journal? You're going to get better, more accurate memories, searing memories at times, because how many of us can truly remember something from 30 years ago or 40 years ago? You know, memories fade. We round off the edges. So I think the key is you need to do the work. You need to get the documents. And even if it means waiting 10 months for your FOIA request to be fulfilled.
Hi, thank you for this fascinating story. I'm a historian of water-based environmental hazards in Washington, D.C., and so this, of course, resonates in a number of ways. One of the points that you mentioned that you might develop further in your text, I haven't gotten to read it yet, is this idea of evacuation and displacement as a result. So, yes, ideally, folks are moved out of a danger zone, but did you come across what became of those families when they were moved? Like, was displacement a compounded hazard for the individuals who are moved out of one area of danger and perhaps into another?
Well, I mean, there are people in this room who could weigh in on this personally tonight. Obviously, evacuation, from your home when it's built next to a chemical landfill sounds like a great outcome. But of course, it is very disruptive to your life. This was, as I said, this was a desirable place to live. People wanted to live in this neighborhood. And one of the reasons why Lois and others faced resistance is because they didn't want to go, a lot of people. And so the short answer to your question is yes, it was traumatic. Families broke up over it. Couples got divorced over it. At times, parents sent children from the houses that they were living in the unevacuated zones to go live with grandparents in other parts of the city or other parts of New York because they just wanted to make sure their kids were safe. And so, I think the thing that resonates with me is, this crisis, acutely anyway, ended 42 years ago. But when you mention it and when you discuss it with people who lived through it, those emotions of that time just come rushing back, and they feel that same anger, that same pain all over again.
Thank you.
I wonder if any of you mentioned in the book would like to step up and say what it means to have this come out now 40 years later.
I'll go for it. I'm the young one here, right? Yeah, I'm the young one here, I guess, of this. So, easiest answer to that.
This is Michael Gibbs, Lois's son.
So I'll actually, where did she go? Answer your question quickly. Socially, for a kid, wholly disruptive in both just the turmoil that was going on, but once you moved away, in this case I had a sister who had issues as well, handling that with people who saw her as a problem, right? And so if you think bullying is bullying, and then you have someone that a good amount of the community may not like, you add additional social. So very disruptive there. That being said, reading through, obviously the interviews brought some interesting stuff back up, right? And some things that you hide for a good long time. And now I'm halfway through the book. I've wanted to wait till it came out before I actually read it, even though obviously I had the chance before. I'm actually at, I think the quote would be, the Italian stallion meets the, what did they call you? Something about housewife. And yeah. Anyways, so, but it brings a huge amount of emotions back up, right? Getting to that point with Luella's son brings emotions up. And the emotions in my case is slightly different, right? Because, as you've pointed out, at least in the first half of the book, on the amount that she sadly isn't at home and how that's causing issues. But it's also causing issues, obviously, on our side, too, right? Because I'm with my sister who does not understand anything. I, myself, is an introvert, or I was, so that didn't help any. And amusingly enough, we also hung out in the basement all the time, because that's where the other TV was, and the dog. So that actually ended up causing other fun stuff. So all that starts rushing back, things that I, to be honest, probably repressed for a while. So it makes it even more emotional, at least from the kids' side of things. And on that, I'll walk away.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you.
Let me just add one thing in reference to the evacuation piece, because we do have somebody here from Griffin Manor a long time ago. And I think that the west side of Love Canal, where Griffin Manor was a housing development that was subsidized, and families who moved in there had to have 5 children. So now think about, there's 240 units and you have to have 5 children to qualify. And when we talk about moving away as property owners, it was horrible, but we could move away. When you're talking about somebody who's on subsidized housing and there's no subsidized housing available, or the only subsidized housing that is available is in parts and towns you don't want to live, because Love Canal was an idyllic place to live. And so it was really hard for the renters in Griffin Manor to adjust, even though they were given the money. So the or the rental differential between what they were paying and what they would have to pay, and a refrigerator and a stove. They had to go live in areas that were just not safe. And they had to do that with their families. And the Griffin Manor folks and families are often never spoken about when it comes to Love Canal. And I just wanted to make a point that, you know, as much as we suffered, and we suffered a lot, I think the families from Griffin Manor suffered even more. And also in reference to health effects, and I was just speaking to this young gentleman yesterday through email, is because they are renters. So when they had birth-defected children or children who died from leukemia, which house do they live in that gave them the leukemia, right? Is it genetic because they smoke too much, they drink too much, and they don't have a lot of money, so they eat carbs instead of protein? Is it because they're living in this other area? And so, you know, it wasn't just about that. It was their fault somehow that when they were sick and their children passed, or their children were harmed, or their loved one, or their partner, that they were then looked at as not a victim, but actually a person who was part of the problem and created their own nightmare. So I just wanted to mention the Griffin Manor folks, because nobody else does. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Lois, for that intro. Wow, where to begin? I'm trying to make this really quick. My phone has been buzzing from my mom. She's been like texting me, oh, say this, say that. Okay, great. Now, but on a serious note, it definitely resonates. I'm sorry. My name is Lonnie Bradley. I'm from Niagara Falls. It's home. You know, it's home. And I went to LaSalle Senior High School, and all my friends, I hung out with them in LaSalle, Duro Drive, right over there by Love Canal. You know, I always heard of it. I never really, you know, dove into it. I was like, yeah, you know, whatever. So I go to UB. I get my master's degree in architecture to become a licensed architect. And during my studies, I'm developing, like, I hear Love Canal. I'm like, oh, what the hell? In the books that I'm reading, the next thing you know, as a coincidence, of course, you know, after my reading, Aaron Brockovich was on. And, of course, in the movie, they mentioned Love Canal. And I was like, oh, shit, here it is. And so, you know, you connect the dots. And then all of a sudden, you know, it just starts to come up. You know, it's just like all the feeling and the emotions and everything. And I thank you, Lois, for actually responding to my email, because I reached out to her. I didn't want to think I was like some weirdo or something like that. But I thank you for responding. And she told me about your book, and I bought it. And miraculously, it came today through Amazon. And I'm definitely going to read this. But actually, I want to... Pardon me? I'm sorry, what was that again?
Where'd you get it? Amazon?
Amazon, of course. You know, 24 hours, great. Love it. But on a serious note, you know, like I said, it's home. And I want to say thank you for, you know, writing this book and all the information that everyone has contributed here into this. And also, I stand here before you, and I want to say thank you for all the families that's been impacted, and also the ones who are no longer here with us. You know, a lot of families are impacted from this. I have cousins who were born with like a 6th finger, you know, and things of that nature. And it pisses me off and it hurts, you know. So I'm like, well, shit, let's unite. Let's make a movie, like a real one, seriously. And awareness is everything. And, oh, man, there's something else I wanted to say. Look, I can be here forever. But, look, I just want to say thank you, seriously, from the bottom of my heart. And, yeah, Niagara Falls, I love it. I mean, like
Thank
I said,
you,
it's-
Lonnie.
yeah.
Thank you, Lonnie. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Gustavo. I bought the book here at Politics and Prose. by the way. So I want to thank you for writing this book. And to me, as an organizer, I just want to tell you how important it is that we document these amazing victories, right? Because in our world, victories are so hard to come by. And, you know, I know that, you know, Lois, Luella don't necessarily see themselves as heroes, but I want to say that these women are heroes, and that it would be lovely to think that this is a historic event that happened one time in American history, where the reality is today there are at least a couple of thousand sites exactly like Love Canal that the government agrees are absolutely toxic and dangerous and deadly. They haven't done anything about it. because they refuse to call on the corporations to pay enough money to clean them up. And beyond that, there are thousands more that haven't even been recognized as toxic, and that those sites aren't placed equally everywhere in America. Like, it's overwhelmingly working class, black, brown, and poor neighborhoods. So I want to thank you, Keith, because this is incredibly useful to us.
Thank you, Gustavo. I appreciate it. So, I just want to say in closing, thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you for standing up and saying your truth and telling your story. You know, in closing, just sort of tied into what Gustavo just said, you know, he's right. Sadly, you know, this is happening still. You know, not with the absurd idea of a school and a playground built on top of a chemical landfill, but in other ways. And, you know, I just wrote a story for the Washington Post that just came out this week about an organic farm in Maine, run by a young couple who had purchased this land because they wanted to grow organic crops. So these are progressive idealists who are choosing this hard path. And they've come to learn in recent months that 30 years ago, municipal sludge was spread upon their fields as fertilizer by another farmer 2 farmers ago. And that has created significant PFAS contamination on their land, those forever chemicals. And this farm is now completely shuttered. And Maine is now counting the number of farms that have this problem, or the number of sites, and they're up to 700. And so, you know, these stories are instructive. Your stories are instructive. And I thank you again for coming out tonight, guys. I really appreciate it.
So for those of you who don't yet have Keith's book, either from us or from Amazon, copies are available at the checkout desk. He'll be up here signing. Please help our staff by folding up the chairs that you've been sitting in and leaning them against something solid. Thank you again for coming.
And if you'd like to have somebody else's signature on the book other than mine, you should ask them. We should get more signatures.